Reid's morning began with the scrape of his boots against the pitted concrete floor of the derelict factory. The air hung thick with the metallic tang of rust and the stale memory of forgotten industry, a scent that clung to his work clothes and permeated the very fibers of his being. He moved with a practiced, methodical rhythm, his wrench a dull glint against the pale, weak light filtering through grimy windows. Determination was a quiet hum beneath his ribs, a constant companion in the solitude of the vast, echoing space. He was tasked with salvaging what little remained of value, a Sisyphean effort in a building that seemed determined to crumble faster than he could dismantle it. Today, the work felt heavier, the silence more profound. Every clang of his tools seemed to reverberate for too long, swallowed by the cavernous expanse, only to return as a distorted echo from some unseen corner. He paused, wiping a streak of grease from his brow with the back of a gloved hand. A shiver, not entirely from the cold, traced its way down his spine. He told himself it was the drafts, the way the wind whistled through shattered panes, but the feeling persisted, a subtle prickle beneath his skin. He was alone here, always alone, and the factory, in its decaying grandeur, often felt like it watched him. His phone, tucked into a pocket of his work overalls, vibrated with an unexpected urgency. He pulled it out, squinting at the unfamiliar number. A distant relative? He barely had any family left, and those he did were scattered across the country, rarely in touch. He answered, his voice rougher than usual from disuse. "Reid?" A crisp, professional voice, devoid of warmth, spoke from the other end. "My name is Eleanor Vance. I'm an executor handling the estate of a relative of yours, at Cassian Thorne." The name hung in the air, a ghost from a past Reid couldn't quite recall. Cassian Thorne. He tried to sift through his memory, a vague image of a stoic, elderly man at a long-forgotten family gathering, perhaps a funeral many years ago. A man whose eyes seemed to hold an ancient sadness. Cassian Thorne? Reid repeated, the name tasting foreign on his tongue. I barely knew him. Indeed. A distant relation, as I understand. However, Mr. Thorne passed away last week, quite suddenly, and in his will, he stipulated that his primary residence, a cabin located in the Blackwood Forest, is to be bequeathed to you. Reid gripped the phone tighter, the cold metal biting into his palm. A cabin? In the Blackwood Forest? An isolated, ancient place. I haven't seen him in decades. His reasons were idiosyncratic, as is often the case with such matters. The will is quite explicit. If you wish to claim the property, I can arrange for the keys and necessary documents to be forwarded to you. There are, however, some peculiarities you should be aware of. The executor's voice hesitated, a brief, almost imperceptible pause that spoke volumes. Reid's unease deepened. Peculiarities? Local folklore, primarily. Rumors of the cabin's location being ancestral land. Nothing legally binding, of course, but I felt it prudent to mention. The property is quite remote, and has been unoccupied for some time. I would advise caution. Caution. Reid thanked the executor, the conversation ending with a promise of documents to follow. He stood amidst the rusting machinery, the phone still warm in his hand, a strange mix of disbelief and a nascent sense of apprehension settling over him. He had sought solitude in the derelict factory, finding a perverse comfort in its decay, but this cabin felt different. This felt like a solitude imposed, a calling to a place that held more than just dust and cobwebs. The documents arrived 3 days later, a thick envelope containing the deed, a map, and a single, heavy brass key. The map was hand-drawn, the lines faded, depicting a winding, barely visible track snaking off a paved road, leading deeper and deeper into a green expanse. Blackwood Forest. Reid packed a bag, a few essentials, a flashlight, and a sturdy knife. He felt a pull, a strange compulsion to see this place. The determination that fueled his work in the factory now focused on this unknown destination. He needed to understand why Cassian Thorne had singled him out, why this cabin. The drive was long, the urban sprawl gradually giving way to sprawling fields, then dense woodland. The paved road eventually narrowed, the asphalt crumbling at its edges, until it became a gravel track that rattled his old sedan. Trees pressed in on both sides, their branches interweaving overhead, forming a verdant tunnel that swallowed the sunlight. The air grew cooler, heavier, carrying the damp scent of earth and decaying leaves. He checked the hand-drawn map again, the paper crinkling in his grasp. The track was barely discernible now, overgrown with weeds and brambles, forcing him to slow to a crawl. The deeper he drove, the more the world he knew seemed to recede, replaced by a primal, untamed wilderness. Then, through a sudden break in the dense foliage, he saw it. The cabin. It sat nestled in a small clearing, half hidden by gnarled oak trees whose branches clawed at the slate-gray sky. It wasn't grand, nor was it particularly inviting. A stone chimney, blackened with age, rose crookedly from one side. The porch sagged, its planks warped and covered in a thick layer of moss. No smoke rose from the chimney, no light glowed from within. It was a place that felt forgotten, left to the slow, relentless reclamation of the forest. No birdsong, no rustle of leaves, just the distant, faint drone of his car engine, which he quickly shut off. The sudden quiet was deafening. He stepped out, the gravel crunching under his boots, the sound shockingly loud in the stillness. He stood for a long moment, simply looking at the cabin. It didn't feel empty. It felt occupied. Not by a person, but by something else, a palpable weight in the atmosphere, a stillness that hummed with a dormant energy. This was more than just a cabin. This was an invitation to something unknown, something ancient, stirring in the heart of the Blackwood Forest. The drone of the executor's voice still hummed in Reid's ears as he stepped out of the derelict factory. Rusting machinery stood like skeletal giants in the gloom, their forms softened by a decade of dust. He pulled his jacket tighter, the chill reaching deeper than the skin. The word, caution, echoed again, a hollow thrum against the backdrop of the city's distant rumble. He didn't understand it, not fully, but it had settled a leaden weight in his stomach. The drive was long, a slow unwinding from urban sprawl to rolling hills, then finally, to an endless tunnel of ancient trees. The asphalt gave way to gravel, then to a barely there track swallowed by encroaching undergrowth. The last hour was a jarring crawl, branches scraping against the vehicle's paint, the only sound the crunch of tires on packed earth and the rhythmic tick of the engine. Sunlight, once a vibrant presence, became a memory, replaced by a perpetual twilight filtering through the dense canopy. The air here was different, damp, smelling of rich, decaying leaves and something else, something earthy and deep, like undisturbed soil. Then, the cabin. Its timber walls, aged to a near black, seemed to absorb the scant light, and the roof sagged like a tired shoulder. The windows, small and murky, were like vacant eyes watching his approach. A shiver, unrelated to the cooling evening air, traced a path down Reid's spine. This wasn't a cozy retreat, it was an ancient sentinel, weathered and silent. Inside, the cabin was a mausoleum of dust and stale air. He pushed open the heavy front door, sending a cloud of motes dancing in the faint light. The floorboards groaned beneath his weight, a deep, resonant sound that seemed to emanate from the very heart of the structure. He dropped his duffel bag, the thud echoing unnaturally in the confined space. A quick walkthrough revealed 2 small bedrooms, a cramped kitchen, and a living area dominated by a massive stone fireplace. Everywhere, cobwebs draped like forgotten tapestries, and a fine layer of grit covered every surface. The air was heavy with the scent of old wood, mildew, and something else, something faintly metallic, like rain on rust, but deeper, more earthy. He spent the first few hours trying to impose some order, wiping down surfaces, sweeping away the worst of the dust. He unpacked a few essentials, making a point to leave the more unsettling corners of the cabin for later. As dusk deepened, painting the small window panes in shades of bruised purple and gray, the cabin seemed to settle around him, the creaks and groans of aging timber growing more pronounced. He was in the kitchen, attempting to boil water on a temperamental gas stove, when he heard it. A soft, distinct click from the living room. Reid froze, a half-filled kettle still in his hand. He listened, straining against the sudden rush of blood in his ears. Nothing. Just the low hiss of the gas burner. He dismissed it, telling himself it was the wood contracting, the house breathing. It was a fleeting, indistinct movement, a deepening of the gloom that lasted only a fraction of a second. He snapped his head up, his gaze sweeping the empty room. His rational mind immediately offered explanations: tired eyes, a trick of the lantern light, the swaying branches outside casting patterns. Yet, a knot tightened in his gut. The next morning, the unease persisted. He'd left a small, leather-bound book, a collection of short stories, on the rough-hewn coffee table before going to bed. Now, it lay on the floor beside the table, pages splayed open, face down. Reid stared at it for a long moment. He was certain he'd placed it squarely on the table. He picked it up, dusting off a faint film of grime. It must have slipped, he thought, the table isn't perfectly level. He put it back, carefully, making sure it was stable. He even nudged the table slightly. It didn't wobble. As the day progressed, a subtle shift in the cabin's atmosphere began to press on him. He found himself pausing mid-task, listening for something he couldn't name. He'd catch himself glancing over his shoulder, a prickle of anticipation along his neck. The small disturbances, each easily explained away in isolation, began to accumulate, forming a pattern of subtle incongruities. The latch on a cupboard door, which he definitely secured, found ajar. He moved into the master bedroom, hoping to clear out some of the clutter. As he pulled open the top drawer, a shower of dried leaves and dust cascaded onto the floor. He grimaced, pulling the drawer completely out to clean its interior. Behind it, wedged against the back panel of the dresser, was a small, ornate wooden box. It was intricately carved with swirling patterns and strange, angular symbols he didn't recognize. Reid's fingers traced the unfamiliar carvings. There was no lock, just a tightly fitting lid. He pried it open with a fingernail. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, lay a small, leather-bound journal. Its cover was blank, save for a single, deeply incised symbol on the front, a circle bisected by a jagged line, with 3 smaller circles arranged in a triangular pattern around it. The leather felt impossibly old, dry, and brittle beneath his touch. He lifted it out, his fingers brushing against the rough, uneven pages. He opened the journal to a random page. The handwriting was spidery, almost illegible in places, but one entry, dated generations ago, stood out. The soil demands its due. The pact holds. A new seed for the ancient root. The words were a stark, unsettling contrast to the mundane dust and cobwebs of the cabin. The silence of the cabin, once a balm, now pressed in on Reid like a physical weight. The unsettling lines he'd found, scrawled on the yellowed parchment, echoed in his mind, a discordant note in the quiet. The land demands. The blood remembers. The pact holds. He reread them a dozen times, each word a cold drop of water on his skin. He was still turning the parchment over in his hands when the first indisputable event occurred. It carried a scent, something like damp earth and decaying leaves, a smell that didn't belong inside the cabin. Reid froze, every muscle tensing. He spun, eyes sweeping the dim room, but nothing was amiss. The dust mote still danced in the shafts of light, the ancient furniture stood sentinel. He shook his head, a forced laugh catching in his throat. Old houses made strange noises, settled on their foundations. It was just the cabin. But then, the floorboards groaned upstairs, a slow, deliberate creak, as if someone had just shifted their weight. Reid's breath hitched. He was alone. He knew he was alone. He'd checked every room, locked the single door. He waited, motionless, straining to hear. He told himself it was the house settling, the old timbers shifting with the temperature. It had to be. The rationalizations began to fray around the edges when a small, tarnished silver locket, one he'd placed on a bedside table only an hour before, slid across the polished wood. Not vibrated, not teetered, but moved with a deliberate, smooth glide, coming to rest at the very edge of the surface, poised to fall. Reid watched it, his mind scrambling for an explanation. A tremor? No, the cabin was solid, unmoving. A draft? The window was sealed shut. He reached out, his fingers trembling as he picked up the locket. He stared at it, then at the empty space where it had been. This wasn't an old house settling. This was something else entirely. The cabin wasn't just old and neglected, it was active. It felt like eyes were on him constantly, a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, a pressure in the air that stole his breath. He could no longer deny the unsettling reality of his situation. The phenomena were escalating, becoming more frequent, more undeniable. He was no longer just curious, he was genuinely afraid. Reid knew he couldn't stay ignorant. He needed answers, an explanation for the escalating strangeness. He started with the few belongings his distant relative had left behind. One entry, dated decades ago, spoke of a secret place, where the old truths are kept, far from prying eyes. It mentioned a factory. Long abandoned, by the river bend. Reid remembered seeing the skeletal remains of an industrial structure on an old map of the property's extended boundaries. Nestled deep within the forgotten woods, miles from the cabin. A derelict factory. The drive was slow, the dirt track barely passable, overgrown with brambles and saplings. When the trees finally parted, revealing the structure, Reid felt a shiver trace down his spine. The derelict factory was a skeletal hulk of rusted iron and crumbling brick, its shattered windows like vacant eyes staring out from beneath a brow of corroded tin. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light piercing the gloom, illuminating ghostly machinery and piles of forgotten refuse. He moved cautiously, his footsteps crunching on shards of glass and dried leaves. In a forgotten corner, beneath a collapsed section of roof, he found it, a small, lead-lined chest, half buried under a mound of debris. His hands trembled as he pried it open. The diagram depicted the cabin's footprint, overlaid with the angular symbol from the journal, and a series of lines radiating outwards, connecting to other points, including, unmistakably, the very location of the derelict factory. But it was the papers that truly seized him. They were old, legal-looking documents, but the language was archaic, almost ritualistic. One, a land deed, detailed the transfer of the property generations ago. An unusual clause was highlighted, of perpetual obligation tied to the land, and offering to ensure the balance. Another was a tattered family tree, meticulously drawn. These were the names of relatives who had died suddenly, mysteriously, their fates unexplained. Reid's distant relative was among them. He reread the highlighted clause, the words swirling into a horrifying implication. The balance. The offering. The crossed-out names. The cabin wasn't just haunted, it was a focal point. His family's history wasn't just eccentric, it was steeped in something ancient and terrifying. They were manifestations of this obligation, a consequence of a pact that stretched back through generations, demanding its due. And he, Reid, was now the inheritor of that terrifying legacy. The land demands. The blood remembers. The pact holds. He reread them a dozen times, each repetition deepening the chill that had settled in his bones. He needed more. He began to systematically dismantle the cabin, not with destructive force, but with a meticulous, almost desperate energy. The air grew thick with stirred dust and the scent of aged wood, a dry, forgotten perfume. He found nothing in the main living areas, nothing in the cramped kitchen or the musty bedroom. His gaze fell upon the stone hearth, its chimney rising like a skeletal finger through the roof. He knelt, tracing the rough mortar between the stones. One, near the base, felt different. Looser. With a grunt, he worked his fingers into the gap, pulling at the stone. It gave way with a gritty scrape, revealing a shallow cavity behind it. Inside, nestled in a web of cobwebs, lay a small, tarnished brass key and a tightly rolled, brittle map. The map, when unrolled with painstaking care, crackled like dry leaves. It wasn't a map of the forest, or even the immediate area around the cabin. It was a crude, hand-drawn sketch, detailing a path through the denser, less traveled woods, leading to a large, blocky shape labeled, simply, the factory. Reid had seen its skeletal silhouette through the trees once, a distant, rusted monument to a forgotten industry, but he'd never ventured close. It had always seemed too far, too irrelevant to the cabin's immediate mystery. Now, it was a destination. The afternoon light was already fading, painting the forest in hues of bruised purple and deep green. The parchment's words had burrowed too deep. The trek was arduous. The path indicated on the map was barely discernible, choked with thorny undergrowth and fallen branches. The forest pressed in, the ancient trees forming a canopy so dense that the twilight deepened prematurely. Every snapped twig, every rustle in the leaves, sharpened his senses, turning the familiar woods into a labyrinth of potential threats. Finally, the trees thinned, revealing the hulking, rusted carcass of the derelict factory. It loomed against the bruised sky, a monument to industrial abandonment. Broken windows stared like empty eye sockets, and sections of the corrugated iron roof had peeled back, revealing the skeletal trusses beneath. The ground was littered with shattered glass, rusted machinery parts, and a fine layer of industrial dust that coated everything. Reid stepped over a collapsed section of a brick wall, the crunch of debris under his boots echoing unnaturally in the vast, open space. Rusted conveyor belts lay twisted on the floor like petrified snakes. Massive, inert presses stood frozen in their last, incomplete motion, their metal jaws gaping. He followed the faint, almost invisible markings on the map, which led him deeper into the factory's labyrinthine interior. Tall, metal lockers lined one wall, most of them dented, some ripped open. He checked the map again. A small X marked one specific locker, partially obscured by a stack of collapsed wooden crates. Dusting off the grimy metal, he saw the faint imprint of a number, almost completely faded. It matched a crude symbol on the map. His fingers trembled slightly as he inserted the key. It slid in smoothly, a surprising click echoing in the vast, silent space. He turned it, and with a groan of rusted metal, the padlock sprang open. He pulled the locker door open. Inside, not a hoard of forgotten tools, but a single, leather-bound journal. Its cover was worn smooth, the leather cracked along the spine. The pages were thick, yellowed, filled with cramped, looping script. The ink was faded, but legible. The first entry was dated over a century ago. It was the journal of his great-great-grandfather, a man he knew nothing about beyond a name on a distant branch of the family tree. Reid's eyes scanned the first few pages, the words blurring, then sharpening into horrifying focus. The entries detailed a life of quiet desperation, a family bound to the land not by love, but by a terrible inheritance. The land remembers the first blood, one entry read, dated 1897. It has always demanded. Our lineage, cursed by the first pact, is bound to feed it. The cabin is merely the vessel, the focal point for its hunger. It grows restless when the offering is overdue. Reid's breath hitched. The parchment's words, the land demands. He flipped through more pages, each one a nail hammered into his coffin of ignorance. Rituals were described in vague, unsettling terms, the turning of the season, the shedding of the old, the renewal of the earth. The journal spoke of a malevolent entity, not as a separate being, but as an intrinsic, sentient hunger of the land itself. It was ancient, rooted, and insatiable. It feeds on fear, on despair, on the very essence of life force, another entry stated, dated a few years later. Our family was given prosperity, but at a cost. A life for a harvest. A soul for a season. And the current caretaker, the one who inherits the cabin, becomes the conduit. He was the caretaker. He was the conduit. They were the land's hunger, manifesting through him, through the cabin. The entity wasn't in the cabin, it was the land, and the cabin was merely its mouth. And he, Reid, was caught in its maw. The sweet, cloying smell in the factory suddenly seemed less like decay and more like something else. Something sacrificial. The revelation of his role as caretaker, as conduit, had settled in Reid's chest like a block of ice, heavy and unyielding. The cabin, once merely unsettling, now thrummed with a predatory awareness. He was no longer just an occupant, he was the focal point, the eye of a storm that had been brewing for generations. But the cabin resisted. A distant, rhythmic thumping began, faint at first, like a pulse deep within the earth, then growing in intensity until it vibrated through the very soles of his feet. He walked from room to room, searching for the source, but it seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere, a steady, insistent beat that mirrored the frantic rhythm of his own heart. He needed to talk to someone, anyone. His phone lay on the rickety kitchen table, a lifeline to a world that suddenly felt impossibly distant. They weren't words, not exactly, but a guttural symphony of sighs and moans, like 1,000 desperate voices vying for his attention, all speaking at once in a language of pure despair. He dropped the phone as if burned, the plastic clattering against the wood. Escape. That was the only thought that screamed through the growing static of his mind. He grabbed his keys, yanked open the cabin door, and stepped out onto the porch. The forest, usually a comforting presence, now loomed, a wall of skeletal trees pressing in, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching for him. He remembered the path, the winding dirt track that led back to the main road, but as he stared, the familiar landmarks seemed to waver. Trees shifted, their trunks blurring, the path ahead dissolving into a uniform, impenetrable green. He blinked, rubbed his eyes, but the distortion persisted. It was as if the forest itself was conspiring against him, twisting the very fabric of his vision. He stumbled back inside, the door slamming shut behind him with a resounding thud that echoed through the cabin. The thumping from the floorboards intensified, now accompanied by a faint, grating sound, like stone being dragged across stone. He felt trapped, utterly and completely ensnared. He was the caretaker, yes, but also the captive. He hadn't noticed it before, or perhaps it hadn't been there. Its pages were brittle and yellowed, filled with cramped, archaic script. Amidst the faded entries, a crudely drawn map caught his eye. The relative hadn't just lived here, he had worked here, or at least, had dealings that extended beyond the cabin's walls. The factory. A place of industry, of creation, now abandoned, rotting. Why would the relative have been there? And why was the cabin, or whatever held it, guiding him there now? Against his better judgment, driven by a desperate need for answers, Reid climbed into his vehicle. He followed the winding road, the forest finally seeming to release its hold, though the metallic scent clung to the air, growing stronger with every mile. The derelict factory loomed against the bruised sky, a skeletal beast of corroded metal and shattered glass. Its colossal smokestacks pierced the low-hanging clouds like broken teeth. Rust bled down the corrugated iron walls, staining the concrete foundation a sickly orange. Windows gaped like vacant eyes, reflecting nothing but the gray, dying light. The air here was thick with the tang of decay, of damp concrete and stagnant water, and that familiar, unsettling metallic scent. Dust motes danced in the sparse shafts of light that pierced the gloom from holes in the roof. Machinery, massive and inert, lay shrouded in cobwebs and grime, monuments to a forgotten purpose. The floor was a treacherous landscape of broken bricks and scattered debris. He followed the faint, almost invisible trail of the relative's presence, a recently disturbed patch of dust, a scuff mark on a rusty beam. It wasn't part of the factory's original design. He picked up the locket. He fumbled it open, his thumb tracing the faint engraving on the inside. A name. His own name. And beside it, a faded, yellowed photograph. It wasn't his relative. It was a woman, young and beautiful, but her eyes held a haunted, distant look. And he was holding a baby. A baby with a familiar, tiny birthmark on its temple, just like his own. You always have been. And now, so are they. A sudden, searing pain lanced through his skull, a vision flashing before his eyes, the colleague he'd almost called, standing on the edge of a precipice, the ground crumbling beneath their feet. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was in him, and it was reaching out, twisting the world, threatening his fragile connections to humanity. There was no escaping this. The derelict factory wasn't just a discovery, it was a deeper prison, and his family, his lineage, was the key. The revelation had left Reid hollowed out, a brittle shell encasing a terrified core. Caretaker. Conduit. The words echoed, not in his ears, but in the very marrow of his bones. The cabin, once merely unsettling, now thrummed with a predatory awareness, a low, constant hum beneath the floorboards, in the walls, even in the air he breathed. He could not be a conduit. He would not. He had to fight back. His first frantic attempt was the door. The heavy oak, scarred and weathered, felt impossibly dense beneath his hand. He twisted the iron handle, pulling with all his might. It didn't budge. He shoved, then kicked, the ancient wood groaning in protest but holding firm. He moved to a window, one of the grimy panes overlooking the dense, skeletal trees. The latch, rusted solid, resisted his fingers, then a screwdriver he found in a dusty drawer. It was as if the cabin itself had sealed him in, a tomb of timber and malevolence. His breath hitched. He needed help. He fumbled for his phone, the familiar way to momentary comfort. No signal. He tried again, pacing the small living room, holding it up, pressing it to the window. Nothing. Just a blank screen, a mocking symbol of his isolation. He remembered an old landline, tucked away in a corner of the kitchen, but the cord was frayed, severed years ago, hanging like a dead vine. The cabin wasn't just holding him, it was silencing him. He closed his eyes, forcing himself to breathe, to think. There had to be something. A memory flickered, a half-heard snippet from his distant relative, a rambling tale about the old place, a site of forgotten industry, down by the bend, past the Black Marsh. A place where his relative had supposedly stored old family papers, things that weren't fit for the cabin. A derelict factory. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was his only lead. The journey through the forest was a nightmare of disorienting gloom. The trees, usually a comforting presence, now seemed to lean in, their gnarled branches like skeletal fingers reaching, clawing. The path, barely visible, twisted and vanished beneath a carpet of decaying leaves, forcing him to push through thickets of thorny bushes that snagged at his clothes and flesh. The forest was an extension of the cabin, a labyrinth designed to break his will. It was a monstrous silhouette against the bruised twilight sky, a hulking mass of rust and shattered glass. Corrugated iron panels, torn and twisted, hung like tattered flags. The air here was different, stale and metallic, carrying the faint, acrid tang of decay and something else, something cloying and ancient, like dust stirred from a forgotten tomb. He pushed through a gaping hole where a massive loading bay door once stood. Inside, the cavernous space swallowed him whole. Rows of rusting machinery, draped in cobwebs, loomed like petrified beasts. Every step he took echoed, the sound amplified and distorted, a lonely, desperate symphony. Hello? His voice cracked, thin and pathetic in the vastness. No reply, only the drip of water from a distant leak, a metallic ping that resonated through the empty halls. He began to search, his hope a flickering ember. He checked collapsed offices, rusted lockers, overturned workbenches. Nothing but debris, dust, and the ghosts of forgotten industry. A small, wooden box, meticulously carved, incongruous amidst the decay. It wasn't metal, wasn't factory-made. It looked like something that belonged in the cabin. He clawed his way through the rubble, his fingers scraping on splintered wood and sharp metal. The box was heavier than it looked, its surface smooth beneath layers of dust. He forced the rusty clasp open. Beneath the leaves, he found a single, yellowed parchment. It wasn't a journal, not a map, but a single, meticulously penned entry, dated nearly a century ago, signed by his distant relative's great-grandfather. The elegant script, faded but still legible, spoke of the necessary maintenance, of the tribute paid at the site of industry, and the binding of the restless spirit, lest it consume all. It detailed a ritual, a feeding, that had to be performed not just at the cabin. At specific points within the forest and at this very factory, to contain the influence. The words blurred. Tribute. Binding. Consume. The symbol, the leaves, the ancient text, the factory itself, it wasn't just about the cabin. The entity's reach was far wider, its roots deeper than he could have imagined. This derelict factory wasn't a sanctuary, it was another anchor point, another piece of the terrible, generational pact. His ancestor hadn't merely stored things here, he had performed things here. He wasn't just trapped in a cabin, he was trapped in a network, a web spun across the entire forest, and he, Reid, was at its very center. His legs gave out. He sank to the concrete, the parchment fluttering from his nerveless fingers. The hopelessness was a physical weight, crushing the air from his lungs. The factory, the forest, the cabin, they were all part of it, all working in concert. He had not found a way out, but rather a deeper understanding of the inescapable cage he inhabited. The entity wasn't just in the cabin, it was everywhere. His sanity, a thin thread, began to unravel, fraying at the edges as the vastness of his predicament truly settled in. He was not just a caretaker, he was a sacrifice in waiting, and the whole world around him was the altar. The words still swam before Reid's eyes, etched into the grime and the fading light of the derelict factory, tribute. Binding. The factory wasn't just a place, it was a testament, a monument to something far older and more sinister than mere industry. It was another anchor point, a truth that burrowed into his bones, chilling him more deeply than the pervasive damp. He pressed forward, the beam of his small flashlight a trembling spear against the encroaching gloom. His determination, a brittle shield, kept the rising panic at bay. This place hummed with a different kind of silence, a vast, hollow emptiness that swallowed sound, even the scrape of his boots on the concrete floor. The silence wasn't peaceful, it was watchful, anticipatory. He moved deeper into the factory's maw, past hulking metal presses and rusted conveyor belts that stretched into the black like petrified serpents. It wasn't a platform for machinery. This was a dais, crafted from rough-hewn stone, scarred with ancient symbols that mirrored those in the cabin and the journal. A shiver traced its way down Reid's spine, a recognition that transcended mere sight. This wasn't just a factory, it was a ritual ground, disguised and abandoned, but its purpose still echoed in the stones. He approached the dais, his breath catching in his throat. On the dais, amidst more dried, crushed leaves, lay a collection of objects, a tarnished silver locket, a single, brittle bird's feather, and a small, leather-bound book, identical in binding to the journal he carried, but thicker, older. The leather was dry and cracked, the pages brittle, but the writing inside was stark and painfully legible. It was a chronicle, penned in a spidery, precise hand across generations. It detailed the binding, not a pact, but a feeding arrangement. The entity, a primordial hunger, ancient beyond human reckoning, rooted itself in the land, specifically in the energy of the burial ground beneath the cabin. It was a parasitic consciousness, not malevolent in the human sense, but utterly indifferent, its existence predicated on absorbing vital essence. It had been dormant, a deep slumber, until an ancestor, desperate for prosperity and protection during a harsh winter, had disturbed its slumber and made a bargain. Not with words, but with an offering of life. The entity thrived on the resonance of a specific bloodline, the very life force that flowed through Reid's veins. The pact was a lie his family told themselves. It was a cycle of forced appeasement. The book explained the tribute, not just any life, but the life of a chosen vessel within the bloodline, offered at the height of their vitality, at a specific point in the cycle, to satiate the entity for another generation. The cabin, the factory, other forgotten sites, they were anchor points, places where the veil between the world of the living and the entity's ethereal hunger was thinnest, where the transfer of life energy was most potent. Reid's gaze fell on a date, circled repeatedly in the journal, a date that was fast approaching. It was the same date his distant relative had died. The relative hadn't died mysteriously, they had been the previous tribute. And now, the cycle had turned. A low hum began to vibrate through the stone dais, a sound that seemed to originate not from the air, but from deep within the earth itself. The symbols on the pillars began to glow faintly, a sickly, phosphorescent green, pulsing in time with the hum. He understood. The entity didn't want him dead, it wanted his life. His vitality. His consciousness, absorbed into its ancient, sprawling awareness. The sacrifice wasn't to defeat it, but to feed it, to buy another generation of false peace for the bloodline, for the next designated vessel. He was the current vessel, the harvest. Become. Sustain. Reid dropped the book, stumbling back, his hands clapped over his ears as if to physically block the intrusion. The hum rose to a crescendo, vibrating through the concrete, through his very bones. He was the sacrifice. The only way to appease it, to keep it from consuming everything, was to give it what it demanded. His life. Or, the life of someone else. The realization hit him with the force of a physical blow, leaving him gasping for air. The lineage of sacrifice, the horror. That transcended time, it was all converging on him, now, in this derelict factory. He was trapped, bound by an ancestor's desperate bargain, tasked with feeding a primordial hunger, or finding a way to starve it, forever. The hum, a low, guttural thrum that had been an undercurrent for days, now ripped through the derelict factory with the force of a physical blow. It vibrated in his teeth, rattled the bones in his skull, a sound beyond hearing, a frequency of pure dread. The glowing symbols, etched into the concrete floor by some unseen, terrible hand, pulsed with an angry, sickly green light, casting monstrous, shifting shadows that danced around him, mimicking grotesque figures reaching, grasping. His hands, still clamped over his ears, were useless against the internal assault. Every instinct screamed for him to flee, to abandon the crumbling structure, to forget the terrible truths he'd unearthed. He wouldn't run. Not again. He wouldn't leave this horror to fester, to consume him from the inside out. He forced his eyes open, blinking through the shimmering air, the world around him warping. The vast, empty space of the derelict factory seemed to stretch infinitely, the skeletal remains of machinery looming like ancient, petrified beasts. Rust flakes drifted from high girders, catching the eerie green light like spectral dust. The air tasted of damp earth, metallic decay, and something else, something acrid and ancient, like burnt bone and forgotten blood. His gaze fell on the heavy, leather-bound book, lying open where it had fallen, its brittle pages illuminated by the malevolent glow. He remembered the final lines, the terrible instructions for severance, the price it demanded. He had to get to it. With a grunt, Reid pushed himself forward, his legs heavy, resisting. The floor beneath him wasn't solid, it seemed to ripple, a fluid surface attempting to swallow his boots. The hum intensified, pushing against his chest, making it hard to draw breath. It was a pressure, a crushing weight that promised to flatten him into the grimy concrete. He felt eyes on him, countless unseen eyes, burning with an ancient hunger. He reached the book, his fingers trembling as they closed around its cover. He pulled it towards him, scanning the page. The ritual, it wasn't about appeasement. It was about reversal. A severance, but the cost. A low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together, emanated from the very walls of the derelict factory. It was the entity, responding to his defiance. The green light pulsed faster, brighter, making his vision swim. He felt a sharp, piercing pain behind his eyes, a phantom pressure on his temples, as if something was trying to pry open his skull. The book detailed the pact, a continuous feed, a lineage bound to sustain the entity through periodic sacrifice, ensuring its power and the protection it offered the family line. But the protection was a cage, and the sacrifices were never truly willing. Each generation was a tether, and the strongest connection, the one most aware, was the most potent offering. He was the strongest connection. He was the intended final meal, the linchpin that would either secure the entity's eternal reign or shatter it completely. The ritual required not just his will, but a symbol of the binding, something of the family that predated the pact's last major renewal. His eyes darted around the floor, remembering the small, tarnished silver locket he'd found tucked into a hidden compartment of the cabin's desk, an heirloom passed down through generations. He'd put it in his pocket, a nervous habit. He fumbled in his jacket, his fingers clumsy, the entity's presence pressing down, trying to crush his focus. The air grew heavy, thick with a nauseating sweetness, like decaying flowers. He pulled out the locket, its dull surface reflecting the sickly green glow. The words, when he spoke them, would not be an offering, but a command, a severing. It was a gamble, a desperate, terrifying hope. He placed the locket on the concrete, directly over one of the largest glowing symbols. The symbol flared violently, a silent scream of defiance from the entity. He drew a deep breath, the air burning in his lungs. His hand, shaking, reached for the jagged edge of a broken pipe lying nearby. He pressed it against his palm, not flinching as the skin broke, a bead of crimson welling up. He squeezed his hand, letting a single, thick drop fall onto the locket. The moment the blood touched the silver, the entire derelict factory shuddered. A low, resonant groan echoed from the foundations, a sound of ancient stone and rusted metal protesting. It was the entity, its true power unleashed, attempting to overwhelm him, to break his will before he could utter the words. It was a final, desperate assault on his sanity. Reid clenched his jaw, his eyes fixed on the locket, on the blood. He would not yield.
He would not be another link in the chain.
He took another burning breath, and the ancient words, heavy with power and defiance, began to spill from his lips. He was a single, fragile point of light against an encroaching, eternal night, but he was determined. And he would break the pact. The silence that followed the tearing hum was not a relief. It was a vacuum, a hollow cavity in the air where the world had just been screaming. His ears rang with a high, incessant whine, a phantom echo of the monstrous thrum that had ripped through him. Every nerve ending felt frayed, raw, as if the very sound had scraped away layers of his being. His left arm was pinned awkwardly beneath him, a sharp, white-hot pain shooting from his shoulder down to his fingertips. He tasted copper and dust, a sickening mix that coated his tongue. Above him, the skeletal framework of the factory's roof was a blur against the bruised, pre-dawn sky visible through the shattered skylights. Dust motes, thick as fog, danced in the weak, diffused light, catching the edges of something he couldn't quite grasp. A memory, perhaps, of what had just transpired. The entity. The pact. The blinding, overwhelming force that had tried to consume him. He remembered a surge of will, a desperate, guttural refusal, and then the tearing. He had felt it, not just heard it. The fabric of reality had seemed to stretch and thin, revealing something vast and indifferent beyond, something that promised oblivion. And then, he had pushed back. Or perhaps, something had given way. He finally managed to roll onto his back, a groan escaping his lips. His ribs ached with a deep, bruising pain, and his head throbbed. He pushed himself up onto his elbows, the concrete scraping against his torn sleeve. His gaze swept the cavernous space. The air still carried a faint, acrid tang, like ozone mixed with burnt metal and something indescribably ancient. There were no visible scorch marks, no gaping holes in the factory walls, yet the very atmosphere felt scoured clean, violently purged. He staggered to his feet, each movement a deliberate act of defiance against the profound exhaustion that threatened to drag his back down. His legs felt like lead, his muscles screaming in protest. The forest outside was still shrouded in the deep indigo of pre-dawn, the trees silent, unmoving sentinels. The walk back to the cabin was a blur of pain and disorientation. The familiar path seemed alien, the trees watching him with an unfamiliar intensity. He stumbled often, his vision blurring at the edges, his mind struggling to piece together the fragments of what had happened. He knew he had faced it. But the cost. The cost was a phantom limb, a gaping hole in his perception. He found himself trying to recall specific details of his life before the cabin, before this nightmare, and finding only hazy outlines, like photographs left too long in the sun. Faces, names, places, they flickered at the edges of his memory, just out of reach, replaced by the vivid, terrifying imprint of the factory, the hum, the tearing. It was as if a piece of his own history had been excised, a sacrifice made without his conscious consent. When he finally emerged from the dense woods, the cabin stood before him, bathed in the first pale light of dawn. It was unchanged, outwardly. But it was different. Profoundly so. The air around it was still, almost unnaturally so, devoid of the subtle hum that had been its constant companion. It felt empty. Not empty in the sense of peace, but empty like a shell, a vacated space. He pushed open the front door. It swung inward with a soft creak, revealing the interior. The cabin felt inert. Like a stage after the players have left, the lights dimmed, the illusion broken. The kitchen, the living room, the study, all were as he had left them, yet utterly transformed by absence. The trapdoor was closed, undisturbed. He didn't feel the urge to open it. The horror that had resided here, that had twisted his reality, seemed to have vanished. He had survived, yes, but at what cost? The blurring of his past, the gaps in his memory, were these the scars of battle, or something more profound? He pressed a hand to his temple, trying to force a name, a face, a memory into focus. Nothing. Just a blank, aching space. He looked around the seemingly innocuous cabin, now merely an old building in the woods. He had broken the pact, or so he believed, but the lineage of sacrifice was long. And as he stood there, amidst the profound quiet, a terrifying thought took root. Perhaps the horror hadn't vanished from the cabin at all. Perhaps, in that tearing moment in the derelict factory, it had simply found a new vessel. And that vessel, he realized with a sickening lurch, might very well be him. The cabin was quiet, but the ringing in his ears, a faint, high-pitched whine, refused to fade. It was a private hum, now. His ears rang with a high, incessant whine, a phantom echo of the sound that had ripped through the very fabric of the air, leaving behind a sensation of raw, exposed nerves. A metallic tang, like old blood and ozone, coated his tongue. His vision blurred, then cleared. The vast, cavernous space of the factory, usually a labyrinth of rusted machinery and crumbling brick, now seemed calmer. Or, at least, it had receded. A deep, bone-weary exhaustion settled over him, heavier than any physical burden. His gaze swept over the concrete slab where the raw, primal energy had coalesced. There was nothing there now, just a faint scorch mark, a circular scar on the industrial floor. No lingering shimmer, no residual hum. The air, though still thick with the scent of decay and damp earth, no longer throbbed with a malignant pulse. He had done it. Or, at least, he had stopped it. The entity, whatever form it truly possessed, had been forced back, its ravenous maw sealed, its immediate hunger sated or diverted. Reid dragged himself upright, favoring his injured leg. It looked like a claw mark, a brutal souvenir from the final, desperate struggle. The cost was etched into his very being. He felt older, infinitely so, the weight of generations of sacrifice pressing down on him. He was the lineage, and the horror, though dormant, was now part of his inheritance in a way he could never shake. The journey back to the cabin was a blur of pain and grim determination. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, sent a jolt of icy fear through him. But there was nothing. When he reached the cabin, it stood bathed in the pale, anemic light of dawn, looking strangely mundane, almost innocent. The air around it felt clean, scrubbed of the malevolence that had clung to it like a shroud. The warped angles of the porch, the peeling paint, the broken window panes, they were just architectural flaws now, not conduits for something ancient and hungry. He walked through the front door, the wood groaning softly under his weight. The interior was quiet, too quiet. He didn't stay long. He gathered a few essential items, a worn leather-bound journal he'd found hidden in the floorboards, a heavy iron key that felt strangely significant, and a small, smooth river stone he'd carried in his pocket for luck. He didn't look back as he left, the cabin dissolving into the mist-shrouded trees behind him. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his bones, that he could never return. The place was purged, but the memories, the terrible truths, were not.
weeks bled into months.
He tried to reintegrate, to find a semblance of normalcy. He moved to a small coastal town, far from any deep woods, far from any ancient burial grounds. He found work as a deckhand on a fishing trawler, the rhythmic slap of waves against the hull a constant, grounding presence. But the world was different now. He heard things others didn't, a faint, almost imperceptible whisper in the wind, a low thrum beneath the rumble of the ocean. He knew they weren't real, not in the way a conversation was real, but they were their asterisk, echoes of the tearing hum of the entity's presence. Sometimes, in the quiet solitude of his tiny apartment, he would trace the raised scar on his leg, a permanent map of his ordeal.
He had one, in a sense.
He had broken the immediate cycle, prevented the entity from fully manifesting, from consuming another generation. He had glimpsed the true nature of the world, a terrifying tapestry woven with threads of ancient pacts and ravenous forces. The horror wasn't vanquished, it was merely dormant, waiting. The lineage continued, and with it, the unsettling implication that the next time, the dormant hunger might awaken not in a cabin, but in the very blood that flowed through his veins.